everyone, it is me, and it is good to see you guys again for another final thoughts / final impressions video. This is kind of crazy actually, because the last one of these soft review vlog like videos that we had made was just like 2 months ago, and it was an initial impressions, or kind of like a first thoughts, first impressions video for the same game that we are going to be talking about from the back end now, and that is for Crusader of Centy. I don't know why I try to open these videos with any sort of vague language. You guys can already tell from the title as well as the description of the video what I'm going to be discussing. But yes, we have officially wrapped up Crusader of Centy, and it was a struggle, you guys, to get through everything. And I don't mean that in terms of the game. I suppose I should open by saying that this last month was nuts with work. There's just been so much stuff going on, and so many delays and hiccups and gaps in my own schedule with regards to editing and uploading and tackling all that stuff. At the time of me recording this, I still have I believe two episodes that need to go up. Naturally, when you're watching this, the videos have already gone live. So, I guess I don't really need to throw this in there and let it be known that I've been riding the struggle bus quite hard the last couple of weeks. But I did just want to throw it out there that it was very difficult to get everything kind of wrapped up in terms of for the channel and for it being posted on the channel. So I do apologize. I know that was a little bit of a cock tease, and I probably gave some of you major Crusader of Centy blue balls because we got so far into it with pretty much daily uploads or every other day uploads, and then there would be a video with like 4 days of a gap, then another video with another 4 days. So I don't know what else to say other than I'm sorry. The month was nuts, but moving forward, I think things are going to be considerably calmer. So yes, that is always good. But I'm not here to talk about my life. I'm here to talk about Crusader of Centy and, fix my hair that is still soaking wet because I just got out of the shower not too long ago. Y'all, I make the weirdest videos. I'm supposed to be talking about Crusader of Centy. I'm telling you about my personal life, and now I'm talking to you about the fact that my hair is wet. Why don't we actually get into my final thoughts on the game? That might be, a good place to start for the video. Okay, y'all. So I don't actually have a lot of new things to add, to be honest, compared to the final thoughts video that had gone up about 2 months ago. So in that video, I explored sort of my 3 big categories. I always like to talk about the narrative with, characters kind of lumped into that, and character development lumped into that, just the story in general. We always look at sound, we look at the visuals / the graphics. Sometimes I talk about replayability. So I'm going to try to hit kind of those major notes, as well as I think mechanics are a really big thing to discuss, both in terms of how effective they feel with their implementation, as well as, just how accessible is everything. Because even if it feels great, if you're not using it much, it just kind of feels like a wasted interaction or a wasted addition, and that's not really totally relevant to this game. But I've had some people ask me in these, well, what do you kind of use as your guideline? And I don't really have a guideline so much as those are just kind of the main categories that always come to my mind. When I'm playing a video game, I sort of think through, how do I feel about this? What does the sound like? Or do the characters even make sense? Etc., etc. So, as for the narrative, the story, plus, characters and that sort of just progression of the narrative itself and all of the pieces that kind of support that, I feel like my initial impressions were sort of spot on. I talked to you guys about how I feel like the game, it doesn't seem super purposeful, but it is cute. I feel like the characters can be described that same way, where their involvement, who they are, the way they're presented to you, also doesn't feel that meaningful or intentional, but a lot of interactions that you do have with some of the humans as well as the monsters and the animal companions, it feels good to talk to them, but you could get by without interacting with most of the people that you will stumble upon throughout your journey. As I named the protagonist Nayak, but if you look through the manual, his name is Corona. I'm not sure if I've talked to you guys about that already, but if I haven't, there you go. If I have, then you already know who I'm referring to if I use the name Corona instead of Nyack. So anyway, I do think that the story for what it was, it's fine. It's really cute. It's quite, I think, intended to be a little bit more dark and sinister and have a meaningful story. However, it does, with the, I think, translation issues, which we'll talk about here in a second, as well as I think the fact that it did get censored quite a bit in its North American release. I think that any of the dark undertones that were intended to be there, or the depth and meaning to the overarching story, I do think that that was diluted with just the censorship that kind of got inserted into the game, and the purposefulness that I was referring to, or that level of intention and just a deliberate tale with deliberate choices having deliberate consequences, all of that felt not as powerful, I think, because certain things were toned down considerably. And I'm not going to get into discussing or dissecting the differences between the North American release to the Japanese version, or I'm guessing even the PAL version probably wasn't as neutered, if I may just be blunt. I know that a lot of people feel very strongly with the whole censorship debate, where some people feel as though, but the kids, and then other people are maybe too far extreme in the other direction, where they're like, no, you shouldn't censor absolutely anything. You know, I'm a pretty neutral person, and I try my best to see both sides of the spectrum when it comes to a lot of issues. But I feel like so many 90s and early 2000s games, they just censored the shit out of them. And sometimes the censors don't even make sense, or it's like you can still tell this is supposed to be something else. The way that they censored it doesn't have the impact that maybe they thought it was going to. I don't know, that's its own conversation, and I shouldn't even be talking about censorship because we're supposed to be talking about the story. But the point of it being, and the point of me even bringing all of that up, is to say that although I am criticizing the game as I received it living in North America, specifically the United States, I don't think that the story had the gravity to it that its original conception probably did bear. So I do think it is important, though, to separate that from what the game actually was intended to be, because I'm sure someone playing the original Japanese version, maybe there were things that made a lot more sense. Maybe there were certain interactions and confrontations that you experienced as the player a little bit more so in terms of the strength of that emotion than I did, because half the time characters weren't saying anything that mattered to me or that meant anything to me. And whether that is the result of poor translation / poor localization / excessive censorship, or if the game never really made a whole lot of sense and the censorship just made that worse, who really can say? But it is what it is. I do think the story was cute, so I guess bringing this to a close. The narrative was great in terms of it not being super boring, but again, I do think lacked a little bit of depth. And the same thing for the characters, where I enjoyed most of the characters that I met. I enjoyed all of the animal companions that I ended up recruiting, the way that they were presented to you. Some of them, it was more so clever than others. For some of them, they were just sort of there. I still feel like Dippy, why did we get a dinosaur and he never really contributed a whole lot? I mean, not in terms of mechanically. I think I underused Dippy for sure, but I don't know why he was even given to our party. It was just a weird addition to the team. But, you know, kudos to the developers for having so many unique ideas that they kind of rolled into one little bundle there, because I do think that by the end of the game, you knew which of the animals were more important than others, and there wasn't a lot of balance to that. But you know, whatever, let's just segue into mechanics because I'm just going all over the place. Actually, no, I'm gonna hold off because it'll be easier to quickly knock out sound / audio as well as graphics / video visuals. So final thing I'm gonna say about the narrative, the only, I think, major suggestion outside of trying to tackle this whole issue of whether censorship was to blame or localization was to blame, I do think at the very least, as a constructive criticism for this game, I think it needed to be proofread so much better. So we're not even talking about translation, but just in general, there were so many grammatical errors. Things were not explained very well, and even if that was a problem in the original Japanese version, I feel like the people who worked on this could have taken the time to write better, to make the script more coherent, to make it just easier to read, and not only easier to read, but whatever the hell you read was accurate and made sense. So I think that a lot of the text, a lot of the dialogue, it lacked accuracy and it lacked a proofreader to the max. So I think that's really the only negative that I am going to apply to it, because like I said, I don't know if it's fair to say that the story was kind of all over the place, because it might not have necessarily been that way, the way that the game was originally conceptualized, but just with pieces that were kind of masked by North American censorship. It seems like some things were kind of lost in that translation, and some of the gravity got diluted and watered down as a result. So that's it for the narrative, and that's it for the characters. Everything was fine, everything kind of had its place, but you weren't really, I think, led appropriately from place to place or through each situation to the next situation. Because many of the boss fights, I feel like, that's something I guess that I can also insert into that. Some of them, talking to them, you actually felt like this person is a jerk, or you felt bad for engaging the being in combat because you felt like, ooh, monsters actually aren't supposed to be the bad people. And we had talked about this in the initial impressions, that one of the things that I did like was that the story the game was trying to tell, it kind of had a duality to it, where initially you're this human and you feel like, oh, monsters are bad, my father is dead, more than likely because of the monsters, rah, 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 screw these beasts. But then there's like a flip side to it where you lose your ability to interact with your own kind, and then you kind of get more involved in things from the monster's perspective and seeing it from their side of the coin. And as you move through almost like this latter half of the story, you are forced to come to terms with the fact that humans actually might be the true monsters of this world, or at the very least they're not innocent in all of the bloodshed that's gone down in the war between monsters and humans. So I do think that there was something there. There was certainly a story that was intended to be told. I just don't think that, the dialogue really supported telling it appropriately. So moving on, that's all I really got to say about that. You guys more than likely watched me play through the game. I said a lot of these sorts of things in the initial impressions. I guess the only thing that I really could add to it is that there was sort of like two parts to the game, and naturally in the initial impressions we hadn't gotten far enough for me to kind of dissect it into two parts. But I would say there's more of the human perspective part of the game, and then there's sort of the monster perspective, or like the animal and monster perspective, where you're beginning to really grow as the protagonist in understanding really what is going on and why it's so important for you to change kind of how history is played out. And you kind of end up being a time traveler, and you change the course of events by changing how the monsters got here, or whether or not they even got here. So I won't spoil everything, although the game was so short, I feel like you guys can just blast through. I think the whole playlist is less than 11 hours of actual footage, because I think it took me about 12-ish hours, or a little under 12 hours to play through everything. But naturally with edits and cuts and blah, 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 you guys lost about an hour of filler. You're welcome. So audio/sound, terrific. I have basically the same things to say that I did in my initial impressions, so I will not belabor this. Basically, I think all of the audio was terrific for the time of this game's release, and you have to remember the limitations of the console as well. I do think a little bit more variety to music could have been great, but it's not something that I felt was lacking to the point where I was losing my mind by the time I had that final boss fight and we were seeing the ending credits. So I thought that was great. Just the variety that was given to us could have been more, but they gave us enough, to keep us from banging our heads against the wall. I think actual sound effects, so not talking specifically about the soundtrack itself and the music itself, sound effects were just fine. Once again, I don't feel like there was anything that felt too extraordinarily out of place, but there was nothing that really gripped me and I felt like, yes, that sounds so powerful as I'm doing something, or that sounds so cool. There's nothing that stood out to me too much, but that can be a good thing sometimes, because I have definitely played games where what made certain things stand out to me was how awful they were. So while it is nice to occasionally play a game where things stand out to you in a very positive way, I'm okay with where this game was in terms of its sound effects as well as the actual audio in terms of its soundtrack, because nothing made my ears bleed. Everything was, I would say, thematically appropriate. Like, music wasn't jarring at all to encounter. So while it did lack a level of being memorable, it certainly did what it needed to do, and I appreciate that. And I would say the graphics, you know, a little bit more positively, but similar to my thoughts in my initial impressions video, that I think this game actually looks great. The sprite work is so beautiful. Everything is so colorful, and you guys know I like a saturated palette where things are bright and so vibrant, and everything just feels clean and it's not super muddy. I'm not one who enjoys an exceptionally dark palette being employed in a game, unless I guess it's like a horror game or there's just a section that's muddy. So certainly there were regions that had more sand or more dirt, and of course I'm not expecting those to have the same depth and brightness to the hues that a place like a mystical forest or like a jungle area would have. Like, I'm not going to hold the game to those sorts of expectations that are unrealistic and impractical. But with all that being said, I actually would give this game a perfect score in terms of, or I guess I'd give this section a perfect score in terms of its visuals. I think all the effects were nice. As we kind of progressed and we unlocked more animal companions, there was one, I believe its name was Moa, it was a bird, that had an effect that made your animal companions have stronger abilities. So if you were Flash and Moa, for example, instead of running 2 times fast, you would run 3 times as fast. So in particular, with Inferno the lion, and I think the penguin's name was Chili, that was sort of the ice creature, and then Inferno is the fire creature, you would see when you coupled them with Moa that they had much more powerful looking effects, as well as the actual impact of it being more powerful. So I kind of liked that when you mixed and matched your animal companions, the visuals of certain spell effects or abilities, it kind of matched how the strength itself increased. So that was pretty cool. It got thumbs up from me. So everything looked great. The visual effects / spell effects / ability effects, the actual models themselves looked nice. I think this game was just very pretty, and you know, the final piece of that being the palette once more. I have to say again that the game looked so cute. I have nothing negative to say about how it presented itself visually, unless again you want to talk about the dialogue and textual issues, but I think that's better lumped into the story, because that's really what it affected, because the actual text and the fonts that were used were easy to read. The user interface, very easy to navigate, because you only had one menu essentially. So there was nothing confusing visually to the user interface. Everything was accessible. Everything made sense in terms of your navigation through the menu. Barely navigation was needed. You just clicked on a couple of things as that one menu was pulled up. So it was quite easy to just mix and match your animal companions and find which one you wanted to use for whatever situation you were in. So the actual mechanics is the next thing for us to talk about, and I've sort of just weaved this topic in and out of the other sections, but looking at the animal companions, because that really is the meat and potatoes of how the game sort of plays. And primarily it stems from the fact that in order to solve certain puzzles, you need to combine different animal companions. It's very specific though. Like, there are some places where I feel like you could use either Chili or Inferno, for example, with a boss fight. Or if there's something that you need to cross, you could possibly use Flash to run quickly and jump across, or you could use Dippy and just slowly meander over it without taking damage, because he kind of like hovers / floats over spikes, and I don't think he floated in lava. But anyway, Dippy could cross certain types of terrain that otherwise you would take damage when you were interacting with that. So anyway, with that being said, I do think there was some level of flexibility, which is a plus for the mechanics. Another plus for the mechanics is that I think the integration of the different animal companions with one another was well done. So again, you could use Dippy and Flash because Dippy was slow, but if you wanted to pass over certain terrain, and let's say you couldn't use Flash as a single animal companion to leap across the spikes, you could match Dippy and Flash and kind of go over it more quickly though, because Dippy by himself moves very slowly. Dippy was a hassle to use. I think Dippy was probably one of the worst animal companions, or maybe one of the consumable ones. Like I think I didn't even really use the bat or the explosive egg thing. I don't even remember what they were named, because outside of our initial encounter with them, they weren't animals that I interacted with at all. And maybe that's my bad, and I could have made certain boss fights easier on myself. But again, and this kind of comes into the, not really, I guess, in the mechanics as much as general difficulty that we can talk about when we refer to replayability. So I'll hold off on that. But the point being, I didn't use all of the animal companions. Some of them were more valuable than others, and I think some of them were better integrated into the story than others, both in terms of, you know, the narrative part and the story part with you actually talking to them and interacting with them, but as well as in terms of the mechanics part of it. So I think, for example, the butterfly monarchy, he started out, and I think there was like kind of a cute story to it where he was this little caterpillar that you met in that mystical forest whose name escapes me right now. But you find him and he's useless for a chunk of the game, and then suddenly he leaves you and then comes back as this butterfly, and he allows you to manipulate your sword in a very specific way that I wasn't expecting. I thought it was creative. You, when matched with Moa, again, remember Moa is the bird that kind of adds a multiplier effect, or it just makes certain abilities more potent or more powerful or more effective, whatever term you want to use to describe that. So if you combine Monarchy, the butterfly, with Moa, the bird, you could move your sword like throughout the map indefinitely, unless you like hit impassable terrain or you wanted to manually call it back. That's a cool effect, you guys. That's so neat that they put that together. But outside of a very specific set of puzzles or a very specific part of the game, you almost never need to use that. It's not going to make sense to use that because Corona/Nyack has to stand still so that the camera can follow the sword. So as an actual mechanic, how important was that one to have versus them maybe doing something else a little bit more interactive with you? I'm not necessarily criticizing it so much as just giving an example of the butterfly and his effect of being able to move his sword everywhere and have full control and manipulation over it. It was fine. I think it was very creative, but I don't know how useful it was compared to, once again, like Flash the cheetah and being able to run much more quickly so that you could go from one part of a town or one part of a dungeon to the other without just spending so much time seeing the same things over and over again. He just cut a lot of your travel time in half. And I think, again, in terms of even offensive abilities, I think Inferno was probably the most powerful animal companion that you had. And while that's fine and it's good for something to be the most powerful, I feel like it almost didn't make sense to use the penguin/Chili is his name over Inferno. Like, I don't know if there was ever an instance where having Chili was better than just using the lion. And I guess that brings up the question then, well, is it just giving you the opportunity of experimenting with different play styles? Maybe you want to use the penguin more because when coupled with Moa, it had like a big snowflake effect, or when coupled with the dodo bird and it stuck to an enemy, like you saw little like frosty things on the outside, like it had a really cool frost spell effect, versus maybe you don't like flame effects or fire spells that much, so Inferno doesn't appeal to you. So it does open up some opportunity for you to play in a specific way that fits your play style more so than maybe one of your siblings or your spouse. But I think if you're looking at it in terms of like basic practicality, I don't know if this game needed Chili and Inferno, and it almost felt like for some of the animal companions, they were there for the sake of having a diverse set of abilities and power-ups available to you, but they didn't all serve as equal of a purpose as maybe they could have if a little bit more creativity had been inserted into it. I don't know. I guess the whole point of me saying all of this is, in terms of the mechanics, I loved the implementation of the animals as Corona/Nayak's power-ups and as his true gauge of strength progression and story progression, as opposed to you just picking up bracers in area number 1 or picking up boots in area number 2. Like, instead of that, they went the extra mile and designed other things for you to interact with, that you could talk to, that had little stories and introductions, instead of it just being like, oh, da-na-na-na, I open up a treasure chest and I have boots that make me run fast. No. Fuck that, said the developers. Let's give you a cheetah. You gotta race this motherfucker, and once you beat him, he will join your team. So I liked that. And the same thing with finding Dodo with this whole time travel thing. I think that's a cool mechanic too, that they introduce certain concepts to you very subtly. Like, we saw this burnt to a crisp bird in, it was either Hot Daisy or Burn Daisy or the cave part of the volcano. But you don't really have any sort of implication that you'll have to interact with this later. And then what do you know? When you go back in time later on in the game, like 6 hours later in the game, it's a living thing that you save, and then it gives you the ability to have your sword stick to things so that you can go back and find hidden apples, or you can attach, let's say if you combine Dodo with Inferno, you can attach your flame sword to the enemy and it takes a little bit of a damage over time effect, or it applies a little bit of a damage over time effect. So really cool concepts, really cool ideas. I think maybe they had so many ideas that they didn't really have the time to implement all of them in as meaningful of a way as certain animal companions got put in there. But the moral of this story, or the point of all of this, is to say that I actually think the mechanics for this game, I thought they had a great implementation. I don't think anything felt that bad to deal with. There was one boss fight that kind of sucked and was really annoying. It was the Puppet Master, I believe was the name of it, that I still feel like didn't feel that great. And although it's not technically a mechanic, I guess we can talk about difficulty as we segue into replayability and just say that this game was pretty easy. There were some parts that I think were more difficult than they needed to be, and it wasn't always necessarily a matter of the controls not being responsive so much as I think things just weren't explained that well. So again, is that a translation issue? Is that a baseline dialogue issue? Or is that a censorship issue? I don't know where to point the fingers, but the point of it being that there were some parts in the game that really didn't make sense and were so hard to deal with and to get through. And there was one boss fight, that Puppet Master one, that I had no idea what I was supposed to do, and it was just a guessing game to figure out what I needed to be using in terms of my animal companions, and then how I needed to be using them once I figured out which ones to use. It was a pain in the butt. I think the final boss too, I believe it was called Spirit Energy, I still don't 100% understand how that boss fight worked. I think I mixed and matched like 3 or 4 different animal companions, and I eventually figured out after like 2 or 3 minutes like what worked and how to trigger him taking damage from me. But there was nothing that felt too intuitive about it. So in that sense, I think the game did lack a level of being intuitive due to some sort of translation or dialogue or censorship problem. And as a result of that, some things ended up being more difficult than they needed to be. But then there were other things that were so easy that it didn't require explanation at all, and you could just like face roll your way through it. So coming together, I would say overall, the game was not so simple and so easy that it was boring. Not at all, is that what I'm saying? But it did lack difficulty in areas that I think there should have been more difficulty. And then with the exception of like that rubber band mechanic not being that responsive, and occasionally when I was trying to run and jump, Corona/Nayak would just suddenly stop. But again, I don't know, is that a hiccup with me not timing the jump right, or was it just a weird wonky mechanic that because the effect with Flash jumping off slime wasn't really explained to me, that there was sort of like a delay that was intended to be there. I don't know if the delay was intentional, or if it was me screwing up, or if it was the controls screwing up, or just the game being screwed up. There were a few things like that, but not so much that the game was a pain in the ass to play. But the game wasn't just a total cakewalk, yet at the same time, some parts of it were a cakewalk. So the game is kind of all over the place in terms of how easy it was going to be for you to solve the puzzles and get through everything. The final dungeon too forced you to really think things through, and I think it was good and bad at the same time. Like, I had to suddenly use Rio the armadillo again and turn him into like a block and then throw him over to open something. I had to figure out the combination of Moa and Monarchy to make my sword move indefinitely so that I could open up a whole section of the cave. So it's cool in hindsight that they did do those sorts of things, and some of the puzzles were challenging to resolve, but it wasn't necessarily challenging because it was a satisfying puzzle. Sometimes things were challenging just because they weren't explained to you that well. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, because I feel like I've said a lot to possibly have not said anything. So I guess the long story short, in terms of this concept and this section of exploring the difficulty and my thoughts on replayability, I think the game is just about right, maybe erring on the side of too easy. I do think that this game will pose some very rewarding challenges for someone playing it blindly, which I did. But I do think there are going to be a couple of spots where you will find yourself frustrated because it didn't explain things very well, or a mechanic such as the rubber bands, like it just doesn't totally make sense how it works. Like, I never figured it out. The only reason I got through like the 2 rubber band sections that happened to be in the game, it was all luck. And I mean, I'm fine with that, but I would like to know why it works the way that it does, but I just did not care enough to sit and mess around with it too much. But anyway, yeah, the game is just right, erring on being a little bit too easy. So just expect there to be some parts where you'll be frustrated and or confused, but also expect there to be some sections that are just so easy that you're like, what the fuck? Like, why did I kill this boss in 2 attacks? I don't understand why this was so easy. Or, you know, there might be a section of puzzles where it's so cool and it makes sense the way that it plays out and you have to think about it, but then when you figure it out, you're like, yes, I'm the best, this makes sense. But then there are some puzzles where you just are like, what the fuck am I supposed to do? Which animal am I supposed to use? Like, what am I doing wrong, game? Did I miss something? I talked to everyone. So yeah, that was kind of my experience in terms of the difficulty. So it's good though. I think I liked this game because I found it quite charming, but I do understand why some people don't like it as much. And with that being said, talking about the replayability, I personally see this game having decent replayability because it is so short. I feel like playing it blindly, I was around 12-ish hours. Someone who's played it before, you can easily knock this game out in like 8 hours. So that's like a weekend, y'all. This game is so cute. It's something that I think would be a lot of fun to play with younger siblings or cousins, or if you have kids, this would be a great introduction to retro games. It's just very simple, and even though the dialogue's not the best, at least in the North American version. Again, I don't know about the Japanese version or the PAL version, but if you are in the United States, I think that while there might be some things that won't make sense to kids, I don't think they will really care that much because the gameplay itself is fun. Having the animal companions makes it much more charming because your growth, your progression, everything feels like you have an actual party going along with you versus you being this independent hero that's just journeying with a bunch of weapons and a bunch of like little tools and things to kind of power you up. I do think that the game could have benefited from maybe fewer of the animal companions, but just fleshing them out a little bit. But you know, that's more of just like a personal thing. I think overall, with what the game intended to do, it did it pretty well. And if there was only one thing that I could just wave a magic wand and change completely, it would be there having been one person proofreading this and fixing the dialogue issues, the grammatical issues, the explanation issues, like just fixing all of that, because textually, the game was atrocious, but in terms of its gameplay, in terms of its visuals, in terms of its audio, in terms of, I think, the idea behind the story and behind the narrative, the game was great and did what it was supposed to do. And it did it in an innovative way, I think, for its time. So With all that being said, I think the game is fairly replayable. It is a game that I can see myself playing again in like a year or two. Not something that I think you'll be playing over and over and over again. Like, it's certainly no Final Fantasy VI or something that you're going to be thinking about it for a long time and mulling it over and just wanting and itching to re-experience the journey. But it is one that I can already feel like, having been done with the game itself, and as I'm going back and still editing and getting footage out for you guys, I am thinking fondly on it and thinking like, oh man, that section is so cool. Or I didn't get all the golden apples, so maybe next year I'll try to 100% it with a guide or something. Like, personally, I would not record anything else for it. But yeah, that's about it, everyone. I feel like that was a mouthful just to say that overall, I think this is a good game. I think it gets way too much flack because people compare it to A Link to the Past, even though the games, in my opinion, are meant to be different while still having some similarities, because they're both sort of like that action adventure style, like RPG elementy sort of game. So you're going to see some overlap, but it's not meant to be the same thing as A Link to the Past. And I will say I think it did some things better than A Link to the Past, but I'm not going to get into that debate. I think overall this game maybe didn't have as big of a budget, and we're seeing some of the effects and the impact of that with how some things were poorly localized. But you know, if you just take this game for what it is and view it as a solo dolo experience, totally separate in terms of comparing it to similar types of games, I feel quite confident that you will enjoy the experience. So what is my final score with all of this being said here, as well as compared and contrasted with my initial impressions video? I think that a 3 to a 4 out of 5 is fair for this game. And I know, again, it sounds like I'm waffling, so why don't I just say I personally think it gets like a 3.5 out of 5, or I guess, you know, a 7 out of 10 is another way of putting it. And the reason I feel like a 3.5-ish is fair, I could see someone hovering down around the 3 out of 5 because this game did have a lot of localization issues or translation issues, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense, and there were plenty of opportunities to get stuck and be confused as a result of that, which could keep someone from wanting to finish the game or play through the game. I also, though, see someone giving it a 4 out of 5 because the game was pretty innovative in terms of how your strength and plot progression worked with the animal companions, and especially with the fact that the animal companions not only had individual abilities, but you could combine some of them for unique abilities too. So I think that is worth something. And I think when you look at this and try to view the game as its own entity, there is a lot of promise there, and there are a lot of things that give it merit and value and make it fun to play, which is really what gaming is all about. It's about having fun. So I think a 4 out of 5 is fair. I would never give it anything beyond a 4 out of 5, but I think a 4 out of 5 is fair. But I likewise think a 3 out of 5 is fair, which is why me, you know, the perpetual neutral in the middle person, would personally give it a 3.5 out of 5. So let me know your thoughts, y'all. This was another long, soft review of a game experience, but this one was a whole lot of fun to play. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed playing it for you, and I would love to hear kind of like your thoughts and impressions on it, whether you've played it before or you haven't, whether you just watched me play. If you did, thank you for joining me. If you haven't yet, I will put links to everything below so that you can enjoy my blind endeavor in Crusader of Centy, because it was a pretty wild ride, so prepare yourselves for some frustration, but also for a lot of joy and a lot of lulls and laughs. But yeah, that's it from me, everyone. Thank you again for watching both the Let's Play as well as this video, assuming you did watch both. And yeah, just please know that I'm quite excited and eager for our next project to be underway. But we'll save all of those thoughts and that sentiment for that game's initial impressions video. So until then, everyone, take care, and I'll see you in our next adventure.